one China policy, is it de facto over?
Well, I don't think anyone is, neither the United States or Europe are saying that their one China policy is dead. I think they're very hesitant to let China define what a one China policy looks like. And China now talks about one China principle instead of policy, which is another thing. So I think both Europe and the United States are sticking to a one China policy, but they're also saying we do, within our one China policy, we can engage with Taiwan. And we have been seeing a ratcheting up of engagement with Taiwan. I think that is a function of growing concerns about China's saber rattling with regard to Taipei.
We will not allow Beijing to confuse our self-defined one China policy with their efforts to impose their so-called one China principle upon us. China has been trying to move the goalpost. I recall when I first came to Brussels and met the Chinese ambassador for the first time, I told him, and I wanted to be clear and above board, look, I've met the Dalai Lama twice and I intend to go to Taiwan. And he said, okay, now put that aside and let's talk. Today, every single visit to Taiwan is being made a fuss about. They try to ostracize people that travel to Taiwan. And we have to defend our own policy, particularly since increasingly the PRC is threatening the existence and the future of this established and lively democracy. We need a solidarity with democracies.
What are the dangers to speak of Taiwan as Asia's Ukraine?
Well, I don't think you can see parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan, but I think these are very different cases. I think for Europe, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been a lesson in the sense that it has shown that relying on a geopolitical rival like Russia for energy, oil and gas, can create problems. And I think in that sense there is a parallel, because I think if there was a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, then Europe would face a similar problem in having to reevaluate the relationship with China, reevaluate its economic ties to China. And of course, the economic ties to China run much deeper than the ties to Russia. So I think you can draw some parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan, but I think these are very different cases. I don't think that, I think that Vladimir Putin, for example, has shown himself to be an impulsive, emotional leader who invaded Ukraine without much of a plan. I don't think that will happen in China. I think China knows that an invasion of Taiwan would have major consequences for China, for the global economy, so I don't think China is on the verge of taking this huge, impactful decision. I think it will want to be 99% sure that it will be successful if it does start a conflict in Taiwan, and that is certainly not the case right now.
There are a couple of points where the comparison may be valid. For instance, I would say controlling Taiwan is as central to Xi Jinping's imperialist dream as controlling Ukraine is to Putin's ambition of creating another Russian empire. Also, the fact that an authoritarian regime tries to throttle a democracy that's also comparable, but beyond that, there are many differences. And I don't think it is useful to be too schematical in an analysis of a specific situation. However, I would think there is one lesson that we can draw when we look at what has happened in Ukraine over the last, let's say, 15 years. I would say today, if we had reacted more forcefully against Putin's aggression in 2014, against Putin's annexation of Crimea, maybe the war could have been avoided by creating a strong deterrence policy. We might have signaled to him that we're not gonna allow this forceful change of the security architecture of all of Europe. In the case of Taiwan, we're still at a point where we have time to develop a policy that can help avoiding a military conflict. Kevin Rudd just last year published a book with the title The Avoidable War, where he argues that indeed, if we come together and be clear in our messages to Beijing, we could avoid that ultimate confrontation. And I'm not happy that so many people, in particular American generals, are always speculating about whether the PLA is going to attack tomorrow or next morning or next year. That is feeding into the Chinese narrative, effectively, which wants to signal there's no way around this confrontation. I think there is. Because if China understands that the price would be high for such military adventurism, if China understands that they might risk the rising of the whole nation if they opt for such a confrontational approach, maybe every January 2nd, Xi Jinping will say, well, maybe not this year. And I would be happy about that.
But what would you think is the motive of these US or former US militaries to announce something like this? 2027 could be war.
I'm not sure I'm the best interpreter for them. I'm not a military person. But maybe some of them want to raise awareness that there is a real risk, and that would be valid. If that was the motive, I would say that's a respectable motive, because indeed, I think we should assume that if Xi gets into a situation like the one in which Putin thought he was, that he could grab Ukraine without Europe getting its act together. If Xi Jinping feels that he could repeat such a coup, he might want to do it. So creating awareness, raising awareness is important. But I think we should do that also with the understanding that it's possible to be successful and that war is not something that cannot be avoided.
But it still seems, from a Chinese perspective, seems to be a provocation with so many visits from Western politicians, because until a few years ago, there weren't so many politicians who were interested in Taiwan.
Well, from a Chinese point of view, from a dictator's point of view, every democratic movement is a provocation. From Putin's point of view, Ukrainian sovereignty is a provocation. And from the PRC's point of view, it's a provocation that the EU insists that we slug out some systemic differences that we have with the Chinese. So I don't think that's a good yardstick. In the past, they have been more calm. But obviously, Xi Jinping has now been fixated on this ambition of becoming a second Qinche Huangdi and to unite all of China's historic territories. That is his hegemonic, his imperialist dream, but it cannot be the yardstick for international relations. Even though China has been pursuing this claim to sovereignty over Taiwan for many decades now, in the past they have been more reluctant to use that as an excuse for militarizing the situation, for destabilizing the situation across the Taiwan Strait. We are in favor of stabilizing the situation. We have said explicitly we oppose any unilateral change in that relationship, which also includes opposing a hypothetical Taiwan independence movement.
Well, I think we have to be concerned about any escalation at this point. We saw China's reaction to the Pelosi visit, shooting missiles over Taiwan. I think it's positive that Taiwan's President Tsai is meeting the leader of the House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy, in the United States, rather than McCarthy coming to Taiwan, which I think would be a more provocative gesture. So I think the Biden administration is also concerned about avoiding an escalation in Taiwan. I think the hard part is getting the balance right between not bowing to the wishes of Beijing and remaining fully engaged with Taiwan while not seeking to provoke any sort of conflict. Because what we've seen over the past, especially over the past year, is that there is a risk of some sort of accident which could turn into something bigger, and I don't think anybody wants that.
Some say the US is using Taiwan as a reason to implement that. From the US point of view, China is a big enemy, and that might rise to a world conflict if the two biggest economies and probably the two biggest powers see themselves each other as enemies.
Yes,
are we standing in front of in a sort of before of a third world war?
I do worry about the tone of the political debate in the United States on China. I think we're seeing in this, with this select committee in the House of Representatives, what could become a dangerous sort of politicization of China policy. I think we need a clear-eyed policy towards China. But we need to also keep in mind the risks. We need to try to remain engaged with China, whether it's in the United States or Europe. Try to avoid provocations, but that should not mean following every red line that China sets for Europe and the U.S. I think. In past years, especially in Europe, you had a prioritization of the relationship with China and a deprioritization of the relationship with Taiwan. I think that is shifting to a certain extent. That doesn't have to be necessarily a violation of Europe's One China policy, but it is overdue and it's necessary, and that's something that Europe should not shy away from. Just because China is saying we don't like this.
How much can Taiwan count on the European Union on the defense level? The Europeans are not playing a big role in East Asia, right?
Well, even in Ukraine, the support from the European Union members is way below the level of the support that the US provide. And in the Pacific region, even though France has some territories there, militarily speaking, we're non-existent. And I don't think that will change much. But we can play an economic role and a political role. And the European Parliament has been advocating for that very stubbornly and very loudly. For instance, and this is also something that the new German government has pledged to support, insisting that Taiwan should be given the opportunity of playing a meaningful role in international organizations like UNFCCC or ICAO or Interpol or WHO. That would be good. That would be stabilizing. It has happened in the past, so it could happen again. Or we could really make a habit of pushing back in every single instance where China takes another aggressive step. The Chinese are very good in their aggressive salami slicing. We're not very good in a defensive salami slicing. We have to get better there.